This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Beta. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Neelam. Neelam is a native of Poland who now lives in New Mexico and has been giving satsang internationally since 1996. She is a direct disciple of Papaji, who was first awakened at the age of 8 during a spontaneous samadhi experience. She is well known and highly recommended as a spiritual teacher to us. So, Neelam, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Okay, we had quite an adventure getting this set up, didn't we? And here we are. Neelam, maybe we could fill in our listeners on your background and how you came to the spiritual teaching that you do. You grew up in Poland, and there were some interesting experiences along the way that got you to India and the ashram of H.W.L. Punja, who's also known as Papaji. Maybe you can give us a quick summary of the background.
Well, just very, very briefly, because, that's a long story, really. But I was already living here in the United States when I was involved with some other teachers and some other teachings, and in particularly with Mother Mira before meeting this lineage. And as a result of that, I would spend really long time sitting in bliss, in blissful meditation. I would experience tremendous bliss, and yet when I would get up from meditation, which sometimes was hours and hours and hours of just blissful sitting, I would experience extreme pain and suffering. And eventually, I remember one time just lying down, and really that desire arose within me. I want to find somebody who is going to show me what is beyond this. What is beyond this dichotomy of, bliss and suffering, right? And so very quickly after that, I found myself in satsang. First, a flyer just arrived in my house, the way it happens. It was a satsang. Never heard about satsang, never, in that way. It was a satsang with Gangaji, and she was a Western woman, and she used to travel back then, spend like a longer time in one place. And so, long story short, I thought, oh yeah, very interesting. She didn't spend her life in an ashram somewhere or a monastery. She's just a Western woman. Interesting. So I went to her satsang, and that was so overpowering. The love that I experienced when I went there, that I basically didn't come back for a few days. And then I came back, and when I came back, my mind just dropped, and I experienced this amazing, just really undescribable dropping of the mind, and just being and just unfolding. And eventually I have written her a letter about this, and she invited me to sit with her and read it. And it was very powerful, seeing the oneness and love. And throughout of the satsang, though, when I was sitting there, at some point I saw Papaji's picture, even though she always had that picture there, of course, but at some point it became apparent to me that that Papaji is my teacher and that I have to go to India. And so, I remember some people saying to me, oh, why do you need to go to India? You got it, it was so blissful to even sitting with you. And yet I knew that there's still some, attachment, there's still something there. And so within, 6 months, I was in India with Papaji. And Papaji came in a dream when I was still, on the way there. He came in a dream because I was thinking, oh, shall I go or not go, or what's going to happen? And he came in a dream, and he gave me a yellow rose, and he said, cut through the dream.
Say that again? He said what?
Cut through the dream.
He said, cut
through the dream. Okay.
Through the dream.
Mm.
So, that's why I knew, like, of course, and I was in India with him. And again, long story short, because I was there 5 months the first time I went, and, in the beginning, I was still not even realizing, very much in my own little arrogance, of, okay, I have experienced a lot of things, I have been in bliss for months, and all that, and what are you going to show me, right? Until eventually, of course, through grace and talking to other people and some other events, I realized, what am I doing? I really need to devote myself to it. I really need to just be here with what's happening here. And so I started to follow whatever the impulse was that was internally arising for me. When if it meant to sing a song for Papaji, then I would do that. If it meant to go to his house, then I would do that. If it meant to do whatever, and the mind would come in and say, no, you can't do that, and just following that inner flow until at some point I asked to sit close to him in satsang, and he let me come and sit by his chair where he was sitting, and I was sitting there with my eyes closed, listening to what he was saying. He was giving advice to a student and to a disciple, and I was really realizing internally, this is, I can trust this. This is true. What he's saying is really true. And so the moment that, trust was there, the moment the satsang ended and I walked out of there, and I made some dinner plans to go somewhere out for dinner, the fear of death arose. Very powerful fear. And I remember sitting in this dinner, and just kind of still bracing myself against that. And then walking out on a street, Indian street, and then 3 little Indian girls came up to me silently, wordlessly, and each gave me a little flower, and that just broke my heart. And I realized I just have to go home and I have to sit, I have to sit with it. So I went home and I just sat, and that all happened very, very quickly. That fear arose, and with it there was the desire to run to Papaji and be at his feet. And then, as I was sitting there still seeing, with my eyes, the room disappeared and the body disappeared. And then there was just simply nothing, there was just, silence doesn't even describe that, right? It doesn't even touch that, so.
Neelam, I wanted to ask you, prior to meeting Papaji, you mentioned, I read that you studied theater, and then you did a lot of Tai Chi, and then you were with Mother Mir, or would go to see her, and then you mentioned Gangaji. So these were teachers. This was during that period of time. Obviously, you were a spiritual seeker, where you were looking for spiritual growth. When you saw Papaji, how did that change? Did you go from being curious about it to being a lifelong sort of aspirant? I mean, what was that transition like for you?
Well, I think the change was really much sooner than that, much earlier. The change happened much earlier, because in the beginning, like with the Tai Chi, I didn't even know that I was seeking, right? I didn't even realize that. I knew there was something, and I knew there was this teacher that, I looked at his videos and I thought, wow, he knows something that I want to know, but I didn't really have the concept of it. Luckily, in a way I didn't have the concept of it or what it was. And then when I was, studying with a Tai Chi master in San Francisco, I also didn't quite yet get it, what it was. Until at some point I really went spontaneously into that awakening, what I call the awakening, the process that leads to awakening, right? That's what I call it right now. Spontaneously, I will have these experiences of walking on the street and suddenly seeing people's past lives and their karma and different things, and at first I thought, I don't know what that is. Am I going crazy, or what's going on here? And so that slowly drew me towards seeking more of a spiritual guidance, right? I was doing some Buddhist practice, I was trying to find some guidance there. But very funny with the Buddhist practices, because I couldn't do any practice. I will come and they will give you these visualizations and, and practices and I couldn't go there. I would just sit in bliss, I couldn't, my mind wouldn't just move, So that's how I realized, well, this is not for me, but, and so eventually I was looking more for guidance. At this time, I already knew, I'm seeking somebody who can help me understand what's happening, because it was happening spontaneously. It was happening already, right? I was just needing some, reassurance. But that, at first, whatever I found didn't quite resolve that until that desire for freedom arose, right? Until there was that clear desire that came at some point and said, I want to know what's beyond this, you see. I want to, I don't want to just, so at that moment, that's how I ended up seeing Gangaji and later Papaji, so.
Neelam, how would you briefly summarize or explain what difference Papaji made in this whole evolution, and what has your experience been since then?
It's hard to speak because when you say evolution, it's there was a spontaneous movement towards truth going on in my life that I didn't understand for a while, right? And then at some point I started to understand it a little bit. But then meeting Papaji was like meeting an unmovable presence, right? There was no way to go past that. The mind couldn't touch this, you see. Papaji was so solid in being here, so extremely just here, that, there was nowhere to go, right? There was just nowhere to go. And I remember, writing him a letter and saying, here I am just sitting with one leg, one foot on the shore and one foot in the ocean, and I'm just, kind of in between. And he said, you're like a bubble, like a soap bubble, all shiny, and it looks like something is going on, But he said, but the truth is you are here for freedom, you see. You are here to know who you are. That's why you are here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what really made the difference, you know what I mean? And also his unmovable presence, just unmovable, There was just nothing that the mind can attach itself to, if you know what I mean. There was nothing that the mind couldn't enter, It was just like, either you surrender to it sooner or later, right? But there's nothing else you can do, right? There's nothing else that can happen. So,
Neelam, I wanted to ask you, how do you define awakening? Can it be described in words, or is it purely experience? And what is the relationship of awakening to freedom?
well, this is after this, moment of awakening, which I call awakening now. That moment when the fear of death just burned through, and it burned through everything, though the whole illusion, and then eventually coming back to the sense of the body and the blissful experience in the body, and then eventually after some hours writing it down for Papaji and coming to satsang the next morning, and walking into the satsang hall, suddenly realizing now everything arises in presence, right? As before, there was Neelam and Papaji and looking for something. Now everything arises in presence. Now there's Papaji and there's satsang and there's Neelam, and all of that arises in presence, right? So I often say awakening is like you walk with your fist closed and you walk out with your fist open,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it doesn't really show on the outside so much at first, right? Even though it does, of course, right? But it's really an inner, just 180 change, just from the contraction to like
Mm-hmm.
it's just here, you know what I mean? So um, so awakening, how I define awakening and how I define freedom, because this was, obviously the change was unmistakable. Everything is one. Everything arises in presence. There is no separation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even though we have all these experiences on the way that we can call awakenings, and I can say in my own experience many different times, many different awakenings and realizations and all that. But eventually, there was this moment where there's that permanent shift
Mm-hmm.
from knowing yourself as this body to knowing yourself as presence, right? And that's what I call awakening now, and there's that permanent shift, right?
So we can assume then that you have experienced this in a permanent way, that it didn't go away, and your sense of yourself as infinite and more than the constrained identity of Neelam in a certain body has not left you.
This has never changed, right?
Okay.
This has always been the same from the moment of, like as before, these were glimpses of that, right?
Right.
There will be glimpse and there will be contraction, and there will be glimpse and there will be contraction. Now this is just the reality, right? This is the reality of my experience. Right?
Okay. So now, given that, a lot of people who teach in the name of non-duality um, make what we consider the sort of everyday life of separation and difference, and you being different from me, and you having to deal with the stuff of your life, and me having to deal with the stuff of my life, make those sound illusory and unreal. And sometimes, from what I see, that can have a detrimental effect on people's lives, because they become complacent, or they tend to think of things as not real. How do you, given your perception of everything as one and non-separate, how do you deal with the stuff of what we call real life? And how do you help other
Right.
people in that regard?
Well, first of all, I make that distinction between awakening and freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by awakening, what I already said, permanent shift from knowing yourself as the body to knowing yourself as presence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then freedom being a true independence from the past. And that means when we really don't act or engage the tendencies that arise, right? Because awakening doesn't mean the end of tendencies, right? So, there's a difference there, because, and somewhere in a way, on the way there, it's not a linear process, but there's awakening, embodiment, and freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the recognition of the presence is our true nature really has to penetrate through all conditioning, right? Sometimes that happens in the awakening moment. Very rarely it happens, but most of the time it doesn't, right? There's still past continues to arise, and we have seen that. People get identified with the awakened state, right? Rather than realizing that it's about being here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to clarify this, this question about your life, and when people say, and I can't speak for other people, what they say, right? But when I speak about it, I speak about, rather than saying this is not real, which of course it's true in a way, right? Of course,
Mm-hmm.
this is just a projection of the mind that arises, right? Life, right? But instead of saying this is not real, I say this is not permanent, right?
Uh-huh.
Good.
Yeah.
It's not permanent, It's not something that is going to stay here forever. So we have to have that discrimination, right?
Mm-hmm.
And let me just say one more thing, though. And at the same time, if you are engaged in a moment in reactivity, then I would say it's real, you see.
Mm-hmm.
Then I would say, if you are engaged in reactivity and then you say this is not real, then I would say you are in denial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, in a moment, there can be only two things. Either you are at rest in truth or you are suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you are engaged with anything and you are in reactivity and you are believing yourself to be something, then you are suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I speak about freedom, because this needs to be seen. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, these seeds would pull our attention eventually.
Right.
They have the power to reincarnate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really interested in freedom. You see, I'm interested in being here. I'm interested in where am I at? Am I at rest or am I suffering? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, Neelam, along these lines, I wanted to get some clarification for you. I believe that Papaji
Sure.
taught, as his teacher taught, that the self with a capital S is already enlightened and free, and yet
Yes,
there
of
is
course.
he's a teacher, he's a guru. His teacher was a teacher. You're a teacher. What is the role of a teacher? If and I think this causes confusion amongst people, and it causes confusion for me sometimes. If you're already, I've heard people say, all right, if I'm already enlightened and free, then I'm in trouble because I don't feel that way. Uh, so what does that mean when you say somebody is already there? And then why is a teacher
Well,
necessary?
you're bringing up a lot of things all at once. So let's take
Right.
it a little slower. So
Okay.
so when you say the self is already awake, that's true. You see,
Okay.
it's natural. Like if you right now, is this Philip speaking or Dennis who is speaking?
Mm-hmm.
Who is
Dennis.
asking the
Dennis.
question?
Dennis.
Dennis. If you
We're all
if you-
one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well. If you direct your attention here, towards presence right now, you see, towards your true nature, just take a moment and really, really do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, beautiful. And in it, is there a question of awakening or not, you see?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
Is there?
Right.
Tell me.
Right.
Is there
Yeah.
a
I
question
mean,
of awakening?
yes. Yeah.
No. Let's just take it slow. Let's take it
Okay.
slow because I want this process to be clear for everybody. I'm not finished.
Okay.
But let's start. We need to start with the foundation, right? So in this moment, when your attention is here at rest, is there a question of awakening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say yes or no?
Yes.
When you are at rest in your
Oh, when I'm at
true
rest in
nature, you are
myself, then I feel purely awake, and yes, I
exactly.
would feel. But yeah,
Exactly.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So the true nature is already awake, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Oh,
it is
okay. I
not
see what
always.
you're saying.
Yeah, but it is not always your experience, right?
Okay.
And that's where the role of the teacher comes in, right? Because the role of the teacher is, what is a teacher? Teacher is the truth itself manifesting in the body and able to speak to you in your own language so you can understand and you can follow instructions, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what a teacher is. So when there is this situation that you know truth, but it isn't really your experience, and that desire for freedom arises, that desire for freedom brings you to a teacher, which is somebody who has experienced that, right? Who knows that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's somebody who really is your own true self, but at first it appears on the outside because that's how we see things at first, right? And so you can speak to them on the outside, so to speak, and you can tell them your questions, and they can answer your questions, and they can give you instructions on how to do things, right? Until you find that within yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then this distinction between the teacher and the student disappears, right? Because really it wasn't there in the first place, you know what I mean? But there was a need for that because not by on your own, on its own, consciousness wasn't able to get it. It needed this external support, right? It needed this appearance on the outside to tell it, okay, this way, go this way, honey. It's okay, it's no problem. Just move this way, right? And so once we can do this, follow that, then we realize, oh yeah, here we are, and that really erases all distinctions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Neelam, you conduct satsangs. I assume you also meet with people privately or individually. Over the years you've been teaching, how would you describe the kind of people who find their way to you, and what is your biggest challenge in working with people?
Well, how to describe people? That's very challenging, because I'm really just in the response to what is, right?
Yeah.
So
well, let me be more specific. Are people coming to you who are new to the spiritual path, or do they tend to be people who have been around for a while and have tried different things and then?
It's both. It's really both. I have and have had students that are totally new. I have and have had students that have done it for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I find is missing, and that's maybe a piece that I'm bringing more, maybe than other teachers. I don't know, because I'm, again, I can't speak for anybody else, but this piece that I find is missing, and that piece is of understanding, really, of what it means to be here, right? That we can have a concept of being here, we can have, even a momentary experience of it, but as long as we don't have the capacity, we don't understand that we are in the human body for a reason. There is the nervous system, there's the brain, there's intellect, there's discrimination, and we need that, and we need to be able to grow capacity in the nervous system. I often work with people who have done things for a long time. They have had a lot of spiritual experiences. And these spiritual experiences were powerful, amazing, but they didn't really sink in, you see. They didn't really make a difference in their daily life. In their daily life, they are still struggling. They are not awake, and they are still struggling, right? And what I teach them how to be here, I teach them, okay, what does it really mean, physically, physiologically? How to train your attention? What do you need to do? How can you recognize when past is present? How can you become aware of where your nervous system is at? I teach them how to do it. I teach them inquiry. I teach them how to be present to the arising past, not just saying, be here, but I'm giving them very clear instructions on how to do it. How can you do that? Because if you can be present to the arising past, you can realize that everything is okay just the way it is, right? That you don't have to do anything, And so that really brings people towards or to awakening, embodiment, and freedom.
Neelam, I had one final question from my side, and I'll turn it over to Phil. But we have a lot of people listening, and people are in different places in their life, and some people are going through difficult times, suffering in their life, perhaps. What is your message to them, and how can they find out? And second question, how can they find out more about you and what you're offering?
Well, my message to them is, what is my message to them? There's so many things I could say, but, my message is that, we have to start where things are at first, right? It doesn't really matter, what's happening, right? So often we are trying to figure out what to do, Challenges are happening, suffering is here, we don't know which way to go, and we're trying to figure it out, right? And I say, that figuring out, that doesn't really matter, or the judgment of it doesn't really matter, or the, is it right, is it wrong, it doesn't really matter, right? What matters is that kind and generous attention towards what is, right? the moment we can turn our attention towards where we are at, what's really here, right? That's the moment that we are starting to come into the present, right? And, rather than trying, right, to be somewhere or be different or for anything to change, or even when we look for awakening, so often our looking for awakening is a mental concept. I want freedom, I want awakening, I want presence, but thinking about it is just moving our attention away from what is, right? And I encourage people to just be here with what is, just start where you are, because where you are, there's presence already, right? We just don't always see it because we are so engaged trying to figure it out, right?
And where?
So I would say,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to
Go
say,
ahead.
and your website is Neelam. I want to say neelam.org. We'll have that posted on our blog with our podcast.
Sure.
But
Sure.
there's a wealth of information there on your website, and I think anybody interested that's been listening today, that's a great place to go to start to see, learn more, and to see what else you're offering.
Sure, of course. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to close with that as well. There's a lot of information. You could see videos of Neelam and hear her and find out her schedule. And she speaks 4 different languages, so English is not, you're not limited to English. And she travels a lot, so you can learn more about her at neelam.org. And Neelam, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. I'm sorry we had so much trouble connecting earlier, but we finally did it, and we're grateful that you took the time.
Very thankful.
Thank you so much. Appreciate. Yes, thank you so much.
Wonderful
nice
having you.
to
Thank you.
be here. Thank you for having me. Yes, take care. Take care. Bye-bye.